Hello, this is Dr. Jennifer Kramer coming to you from the Frisco campus of Collin College. Today I'd like to talk to you about rhetorical analysis essays, their structure and style. One disclaimer, throughout my talk I'll be referring to Tim Urban's popular 2016 TED Talk, Inside the Mind of a Master Procrastinator. You can find the TED Talk linked here. I highly recommend it if you've never seen it, because it is engaging and also thought-provoking. What is a rhetorical analysis? Your professor has assigned you a rhetorical analysis essay, but what does this mean? A rhetorical analysis essay is a common assignment in English 1301 and English 1302. Sometimes you may even do a rhetorical analysis in a history class. Your professor is wanting you to analyze an essay or speech, which means to closely examine the smaller parts of the essay in order to make an argument about its meaning or effectiveness. Most of the time, professors want you to argue why an essay, speech, etc. is effective or not, using its rhetorical elements as evidence. More on this in a bit. Now what? The first step is to choose a piece you'd like to analyze. I suggest choosing an essay that you have an opinion on in terms of its effectiveness, but to be very careful not to let your opinion on the text subject matter waylay you from your analysis task. If you agree with the writer so much on their argument that you can't see flaws in the argument, then maybe that's not the right text for you to choose. Now, maybe you're supposed to find a piece to analyze on your own. If this is the case, be sure to ask your professor about his own criteria. Will he allow you to analyze a TED Talk? There are many excellent ones out there, and you can find transcripts of them on the TED website. If you're supposed to do an essay or famous speech instead, try visiting sites that compile lists of famous speeches or essays. Popular writers to analyze include Martin Luther King Jr., Ronald Reagan, John F. Kennedy, and Winston Churchill. But be very careful if you choose one of these very famous speakers. Sometimes students feel uncertain about their ability to understand the speaker's meaning, and so they are tempted to do some internet searching to help them out. Be sure to ask your professor if you're allowed to use secondary sources in this assignment. If you aren't, it's best to stay away from internet queries. If you are, then please take good notes and properly cite any outside sources. You don't want to inadvertently plagiarize. Of course, maybe your professor gave you a list of essays, speeches, TED Talks, etc. to choose from, and you don't have to worry so much about topic selection. So what should you be looking for when you read over or listen to your text? You can listen for the big three Aristotle's appeals: logos, logic; pathos, emotion; and ethos, character. I don't have time in this lecture to go into these as terms of definitions, and you may have discussed them in your own English class or in earlier English classes, including in high school. I would not recommend trying to cover all three of these appeals in one paper unless your professor has directed you to do so. Instead, I would concentrate, if you want to talk about appeals, on which one the writer uses most effectively or ineffectively. You can also look for how the speaker or writer organizes the piece. Is there a controlling analogy, for instance? In Susan Cain's famous TED Talk, The Power of Introverts, for example, she uses a suitcase analogy at various times in her lecture to organize her thoughts and her message. Does the writer or speaker use a particular tone of voice? For instance, is there a lot of sarcasm, humor, etc.? Is this tone effective for the intended audience, or does it fall flat? You can also think about what assumptions the writer makes, especially about his or her audience. Is he speaking to a hostile audience? If so, how can you tell, and what strategies does he use? And are these strategies effective? Is she speaking to an audience that is fairly ignorant about her topic? If so, how does she inform them while holding their attention? You can also look for literary features like figurative language, similes, imagery, personification, etc., word choice, and allusions, which are references to other works or events. You can use the attached handout to help you analyze an essay. Mainly, you want to look for patterns. What do you have the most notes on after you complete the form? What strikes you as the most compelling or off-putting elements of your piece? In my Inside the Mind of a Master Procrastinator example, for instance, I noticed the audience and myself laughing a lot. What is making us laugh? Well, urban stories, also known as anecdotes, his graphics, and his vocabulary. Now that I've noticed a controlling technique, humor in the case of my example, I want to decide about my text's effectiveness. Is humor in the TED Talk by Urban an effective technique? An ineffective technique? Or is it a mixed bag? If I decide it's a mixed bag, in other words, a mix of both ineffective and effective elements, I still need to determine if overall the essay is effective or not, even if I think it's 51% effective and 49% ineffective. I need to decide this in order to structure a proper thesis. And then I need to think of what are the main strategies by which the author illustrates the effectiveness or ineffectiveness. Here are some examples of rhetorical analysis essay thesis statements. For example, if I want to say that the text I analyzed is effective, I could say something like this. Tim Urban's message about procrastination effectively impacts his audience because his strategies make this message so relatable. If I want to say that the text analyzed is ineffective, I could write a statement like this. Thompson's attempts to convince his audience of the need for immediate action on climate change is unsuccessful because he insults his readers. If I want to indicate a mixed bag, some effective and some ineffective, also known as a nuanced thesis, I could write something like this. Although Myers includes many convincing logical arguments, her readers may doubt her objectivity because of her sarcastic tone. I have a special word on nuanced theses. This kind of thesis discusses both the positive and negative aspects of the writer's use of rhetoric. If you're going to write a nuanced thesis, I recommend putting the lesser point first and ending on the stronger point. In other words, if your essay that you're analyzing is 70% ineffective and only 30% effective, then address the effective part first in your thesis so that you can end your essay on the main point. Use a subordinating conjunction to connect the ideas in your thesis. Subordinating conjunctions are connecting words that join unequal things. I learned a mnemonic many years ago for the most common of these subordinating conjunctions, awubis, as you see written here. This stands for as, although, after, while, when, unless, until, before, because, if, and since. There are others, however, like even though. Here's an example of a nuanced thesis. Again, notice how the minority position is given first. Even though Jones's humor falls flat at times, she is mostly effective at convincing her audience of her sincerity. Therefore, she comes across as a credible source, and readers trust her. The example indicates that the writer will spend a little bit of time talking about Jones's rhetorical fail in terms of her humor, but spend most of the paper arguing that the sincerity of her tone ultimately made her message really effective. So we've talked about what to do in a thesis, address the effectiveness and the technique by which the effectiveness or ineffectiveness is demonstrated, and how to write a thesis that indicates your piece is ineffective, it's effective, or it's nuanced. Let's talk about what not to do in a thesis for a rhetorical analysis essay. Again, it's best to check with your professor about specifics. First, do not make a statement of facts or statistics. This is not an argument. Do not merely summarize the author's point. Again, that's not argumentative, and the thesis for my rhetorical analysis essay should be argumentative. Do not state what you are going to do in the essay. The reader will be able to tell what you do when you do it. Do not make vague or broad statements. Make sure your language is specific enough so that your reader knows how you feel about the effectiveness and why. And then it's not your point to disagree or agree with the author's argument. This isn't a response or a refutation paper, it's an analysis. That's why I recommend not analyzing papers, essays, articles, speeches, etc., that you have a really, really strong reaction to in terms of their content. Here's some bad examples just to illustrate what I meant. In terms of a statement of facts or statistics, depression is a big issue in society today. That is not an appropriate thesis statement for a rhetorical analysis essay. The author claims depression is a big issue in society today. This statement is just summarizing the author's main point and not making an argument about it, so it's not going to make it in terms of a rhetorical analysis thesis. I'm going to examine how this author uses pathos, ethos, and logos to convince his audience. In this example, the writer is telling the reader what she is going to do, but she's not making an actual argument. The author relates many details and showcases humor in talking about depression. Again, this statement is kind of vague and broad and doesn't address the effectiveness of the technique. Or finally, this one. The author should focus more on anxiety because that's a bigger mental health issue in today's society. This is the writer disagreeing with their author's premise, which is not the point of a rhetorical analysis essay. Now that you have a thesis statement, your purpose is to introduce an ignorant reader to your text, the one that you pick to analyze, and to build motivation for your thesis. I recommend using the following structure, which is found in Style, The Basics of Clarity and Grace by Williams and Beesup. Hook, also known as a prelude, shared context, problem, and thesis. Let's talk about your hook first. Your ignorant but not stupid, just unaware reader is coming to your paper perhaps after having read a different paper about a different topic, or having had a stressful phone call, or having exercised, watched Netflix, or picked up a kid from school. In other words, your reader hasn't been living and breathing your essay for the last week or so. For that reason, writers need to provide a smooth transition from the everyday world into the world of their essay. Because of this, you need a solid hook. Many students struggle with how to begin a paper and use tired strategies like dawn of time. For example, people have always put things off to the last minute, or war has always been with us. You only have a limited amount of words to get your point across in a rhetorical analysis essay, so don't waste paper real estate with a meaningless beginning. Instead, use one of the following techniques. An anecdote. Choose a story from the work itself, summarized, or a personal anecdote that relates in some way to the work's theme, or an historical event, or something from the world of entertainment, the news, or literature that relates to your text. That's one strategy. Another strategy for a hook is to use an epigraph. An epigraph is an opening quote. Now, I don't recommend hopping over to brainyquotes.com and grabbing a random quote from Albert Einstein for this. Use a quote from the work itself. That's the best strategy. If you do go elsewhere for a quote, you should make sure that that quote is closely related to the topic of your text that you're analyzing. By starting with a quote, you instantly have something to do. You must comment on this quote, and then you can gradually delve into the next section of the introduction. A third effective hook strategy is the interesting fact. Make sure it has something that relates to your text topic, and make sure that you cite your source for this fact if it's something that is not general knowledge. The next section of your introduction is the shared context. Remember that you are writing for an ignorant but intelligent reader. In other words, write like your reader has not read or heard the text that you are analyzing, even if they probably have. For this reason, you should provide some background information right off the bat for the introduction. For example, give the context of the speech, including any pertinent historical background. For instance, with speeches of historical significance, like MLK's letter from Birmingham jail, or JFK's space speech, or Churchill's fight on the beaches speech, you need to give at least 2 sentences that explain the historical moment. Why is MLK in jail? Who is he writing to? What are the circumstances that caused Churchill to create his fight on the beaches speech, etc.? For other speeches, talk about the context as well. What is this thing that you are analyzing? Is it a TED Talk, a blog post, an editorial? Who is the author, and what is her expertise on the topic? When and where was this piece published or spoken? Finally, in the shared context section of the introduction, you should give a summary of the piece's main points. Use discipline here. You can give a summary in other places as needed. Keep this bit to around 2 to 3 sentences. Now that you've given background on the speech, it's time to make that background problematic. This problematizing will create a reason for your thesis. It builds motivation by providing exigency, the so what for why your thesis will be important. In my Tim Urban procrastination TED Talk, for instance, I could talk in the shared context about the seriousness of Urban's procrastination message to set up the switch to my thesis, where I'll discuss the effectiveness of his humor. I want to focus on how Urban makes his thesis so memorable, and so I need to create a problem that my thesis is going to solve. You should come into your intro with a thesis in mind, of course, but it should go at the end of the introduction, unless your professor has directed you otherwise. Why is this? Well, readers are expecting it to be here, and in American academic style, we write to make things easiest for the reader. But also, the writer needs to build motivation for my thesis, and I can't build motivation if I put my thesis first. Now that I've got my thesis and intro paragraph down, how do I organize the rest of my paper? Well, your thesis is going to determine your essay's structure. For example, if your thesis is all positive or all negative, in other words, you're saying that the text is all effective or totally ineffective, then spend 3 to 4 body paragraphs discussing the features of the essay that lead to the positive or negative impression. Let's look at an example with this thesis. Tim Urban's message about procrastination effectively impacts his audience because his strategies make this message so relatable. This thesis is telling me that I should have body paragraphs proving how several of Urban's rhetorical strategies make him so relatable. So, paragraph 2 might address his personal anecdotes, paragraph 3 might talk about his humorous drawings, and paragraph 4 might delve into his use of casual vocabulary instead of scientific terminology. At the beginning of each of these body paragraphs, I'm going to write a topic sentence that announces to my reader how that paragraph is going to fit in with the thesis. So in the example here on paragraph 2, I might say something like this. One way Urban makes his message so relatable is that he includes personal anecdotes that help his audience connect to his message. If I'm writing a nuanced thesis, then the first body paragraph, paragraph 2, more than likely, will address the minority opinion, and the rest of my paragraphs will prove the majority opinion. Take this example of a nuanced thesis. Although Myers includes many convincing logical arguments, her readers may doubt her objectivity because of her sarcastic tone. Well, to organize this paper, I'd talk about her logic in paragraph 2, which is the positive part and the minority of the effectiveness of this essay. And then I would spend the rest of the body paragraphs discussing how Myers' sarcastic tone undermines her overall message in her work. I'd like to say a special word about conclusions. Just like introductions, many students feel cheesy or insecure about writing conclusions. They often don't know what to do other than just to summarize their arguments. In a conclusion, you have 2 jobs. Number 1 is to summarize your overall argument, just like you've been taught before. Spend 2 to 3 sentences on this. Your second job is to extend the argument in order to show its significance. How can you extend an argument, you may ask? Well, here are some ideas. You could engage in counter-argument. In other words, argue the other side of the effectiveness issue. Critique an essay you've mostly praised in the body of the paper, or praise part of an essay you've mostly critiqued. Just make sure you turn it back and refute your counterargument so that you can get back on track and your reader is not confused. You could also revisit the historical significance of your speech or essay. What is its overall importance? How did it compare to other speeches by that writer or by other writers? You can also, with your professor's permission, demonstrate personal significance. What drew you to choose this essay or speech or TED Talk? Did its message resonate with you in some way? At the very end of your essay, it's particularly nice touch if you can create an Ouroboros, pictured here. This is also called snakebite's tail, even though sometimes images depict a dragon instead of a snake. The Ouroboros is an ancient Egyptian symbol that was adopted by mystic philosophies, including alchemy, and is a symbol of wholeness or infinity. What does this mean for writing? It means to return to your hook and reevaluate it in light of the argument you've just made. Re-engage with that anecdote, that quote, or that interesting fact. End as you started to create a stylistically beautiful analysis essay.